Every morning I wake up to a new headline lying about me.
The internet is absolutely on fire right now after Druski dropped a new parody video that has social media divided, laughing, and arguing all at the same time. Within hours of its release, clips from the video started spreading everywhere: TikTok, X, Instagram, and suddenly, one name was at the center of it all: Erika Kirk. What was supposed to be just another comedy skit quickly turned into a full-blown online storm. Some viewers say Druski's performance was just satire, pointing out that he has always built his brand on exaggerated characters and sharp social commentary. But others say this time hit differently: too close, too specific, and too pointed at real public moments that people instantly recognized. And that's where things escalated. Because once the internet starts connecting clips, interviews, old footage, and public appearances, the narrative stops being just about comedy. It turns into a debate about intention, perception, and whether parody crosses a line when real public figures feel like they're being directly portrayed. Erika Kirk supporters argue the reaction is unfair and blown out of proportion, saying she's being dragged into internet discourse she didn't ask for. Meanwhile, critics say the parody only went viral because it tapped into already existing conversations people were already having online. But what really pushed this into another level was the sheer speed of it all. One upload, millions of views, non-stop reposts, reaction videos, and commentary threads exploding across every platform, all within a single day. Now the question dominating the internet is simple: was this just comedy doing what comedy does, or has Druski once again sparked a cultural moment that nobody can control anymore? And the answer might not be as simple as anyone expected. To understand why this parody video exploded the way it did, you can't look at it as an isolated moment. On its own, it's just another Druski upload, a comedian known for exaggerated characters, awkward social situations, and sketches that push right up against real-world personalities without fully naming them. But on the internet, nothing exists in isolation anymore. Everything gets connected, reframed, and reinterpreted through whatever conversations are already trending at the time. And in this case, the timing did most of the heavy lifting. Erika Kirk has already been a heavily discussed public figure for months, largely due to her visibility in conservative media spaces and her transition into leadership roles after the passing of Charlie Kirk. That shift alone placed her under a microscope. Any public appearance, speech, outfit choice, or interview became part of a larger narrative being constructed not just by supporters, but also by critics and online commentators who analyze every detail frame by frame. That kind of visibility creates something very specific in internet culture: a feedback loop. The more someone is discussed, the more content gets made about them. The more content gets made, the more algorithms push it. And the more it spreads, the more people start forming opinions based not on direct knowledge, but on edited clips, reaction videos, and commentary breakdowns. So when Druski released a parody that many viewers believed was loosely inspired by real public personalities and media archetypes, it didn't land in a neutral environment. It landed in a highly charged digital space already filled with opinions, assumptions, and ongoing debates. Within hours, comment sections were split into two completely different realities. One side saw it as classic Druski comedy, exaggerated, fictional, and no different from what he's always done. The other side saw it as something more pointed, arguing that the mannerisms, tone, and staging of the character felt too recognizable to ignore. This is where modern internet culture becomes complicated. Parody has always existed, but social media has removed the distance between performer and audience. In the past, satire was consumed and forgotten. Now, it is dissected in real time, slowed down, clipped, compared, and analyzed against real-life footage. A single facial expression or phrase can be matched with archived interviews within minutes. As clips from the video began circulating, users started stitching together comparisons. Side-by-side edits appeared. Old speeches and appearances were replayed next to Druski's character performance. Influencers began reacting, each adding their own interpretation. And as always, the algorithm rewarded engagement, meaning the more controversial the interpretation, the more visibility it gained. At the same time, Erika Kirk's public profile was already under ongoing scrutiny due to her increased media presence and the symbolic weight of her position. Any figure operating in that kind of environment inevitably becomes a lightning rod for interpretation. Supporters tend to view criticism as unfair targeting, while critics tend to interpret visibility as fair game for satire and commentary. Both sides become increasingly entrenched, and nuance gets lost in the middle. This is important because it explains why Druski's video didn't need to directly mention anyone. The internet did that part on its own. Once viewers decide a character represents someone, whether correctly or incorrectly, the narrative shifts entirely out of the creator's control. From that point forward, the content stops being just a sketch, it becomes evidence in an argument people are already having. That's exactly what happened here. As the video spread, so did interpretations of intent. Some users insisted it was harmless comedy, pointing out that Druski has built his entire career on playing exaggerated versions of real-world personalities without ever directly naming them. Others argued that this particular sketch felt different, not necessarily because of what was said, but because of what viewers believed it was referencing. And once that belief spreads, it becomes self-reinforcing. People begin watching the video not as neutral viewers, but as participants in a debate. Every gesture becomes symbolic. Every line becomes loaded. Every expression becomes something to analyze rather than something to enjoy. Meanwhile, commentary channels and reaction creators amplified the moment even further. Many of them broke the video down frame by frame, offering theories about references, inspiration, and hidden meaning. Whether or not those interpretations were accurate became secondary to the fact that they were engaging. And engagement, in the modern attention economy, is what determines what survives and what disappears. Erika Kirk herself was quickly pulled into that conversation space, not necessarily through direct involvement, but through association and audience interpretation. That's one of the defining features of viral culture today. Public figures don't need to respond for narratives to form around them. Silence does not prevent speculation, it often accelerates it. At the same time, Druski's established reputation played a major role in how the video was received. Because he is known for satire and character-based humor, many fans immediately defended the video as consistent with his brand. In their view, the outrage wasn't about the content itself, but about people choosing to interpret comedy as commentary. Critics, however, saw it differently. They argued that even if the intent was comedic, the impact was still real, especially when audiences begin mapping fictional characters onto real individuals. That tension between intent and impact is at the center of almost every viral controversy in modern entertainment. Creators focus on what they meant. Audiences focus on what they felt. And in this case, what people felt is what drove the story. Within 24 hours, the parody had moved far beyond its original upload. It was no longer just a video. It was a talking point in political spaces, entertainment circles, and social media commentary ecosystems. Each group interpreted it through its own lens, adding new layers of meaning as it spread. By the time mainstream commentary picked it up, the narrative had already evolved multiple times. What started as a sketch had become a symbol, not because of the video alone, but because of everything surrounding it: timing, audience perception, and the existing public discourse around Erika Kirk. And that is the real background to this entire situation. Not just a comedian releasing content, but a digital environment where interpretation moves faster than intent, and where a single viral moment can absorb years of public perception in a matter of hours. This is why the reaction wasn't just about laughter or criticism. It was about what people believe the parody represents, what it reflects, and what it says about the individuals being discussed, fairly or unfairly, in the broader cultural conversation. And once that kind of narrative takes hold online, it rarely stays contained for long. The moment the parody video hit peak circulation, the entire conversation shifted from "this is funny" to "this means something." That shift is where the real conflict began, not in the content itself, but in the interpretations being layered on top of it by millions of viewers who were no longer watching passively. Within hours, the comment sections stopped behaving like comment sections. They started behaving like courtrooms. Every frame of the video was being treated as evidence. Every gesture was being cross-examined. Every line of dialogue was being interpreted as either intentional reference or coincidental overlap. And once that happens online, the original intent of a video becomes almost irrelevant. At the center of this storm was Erika Kirk, not because she directly responded at first, but because audiences had already assigned meaning to the parody character. Whether accurate or not, viewers began mapping traits, mannerisms, and speech patterns onto her public persona. That association, once it reached critical mass, became self-sustaining. And that is where the first real conflict emerged, the clash between intent versus interpretation. On one side were viewers defending Druski's creative freedom. They argued that parody is built on exaggeration and recognition, not direct identification. To them, the character was not a real person at all, but a composite, a blend of public behaviors, media stereotypes, and exaggerated personality traits that comedians use to reflect culture back at itself. On the other side were viewers who believed the sketch crossed a line. They argued that the resemblance was too specific in tone and presentation, too closely aligned with real public moments that had already circulated widely online. To them, this was not just satire, it was targeted imitation that blurred the line between comedy and character assassination. And neither side was willing to back down. As the debate intensified, a new layer entered the conversation. Past public appearances, speeches, and media clips featuring Erika Kirk began resurfacing. Not in an organized way, but through algorithmic amplification. Short clips were stitched together and reposted, often without context, creating a fragmented collage of moments that viewers used to support whatever argument they already believed. This is where the situation escalated beyond entertainment and entered cultural conflict territory. Because now, the parody was no longer being judged in isolation. It was being compared directly to real-world footage. Side-by-side videos started appearing, one screen showing the Druski character, the other showing public speeches and appearances. The internet loves comparisons because they feel conclusive, even when they are not. They create the illusion of clarity in situations that are actually subjective. And in this case, those comparisons only deepened the divide. Then came the first major twist, the moment that transformed this from viral controversy into something far more unpredictable. A wave of reaction content began surfacing from influencers, commentary channels, and political media personalities who were not originally part of the discussion. These weren't just fans or casual viewers anymore. These were people with platforms, audiences, and incentives to amplify engagement. Some defended the parody as harmless satire and praised Druski for pushing creative boundaries. Others criticized it as irresponsible timing, arguing that once a public figure is in a sensitive spotlight, parody becomes more complicated and potentially more damaging. But what made this twist significant was not the opinions themselves, it was the speed at which institutional voices began to take notice. Media figures started referencing the video. Podcasts began breaking it down. Short segments appeared on live streams and news-style commentary shows. The parody was no longer just internet content, it had entered the broader media ecosystem. And once that happens, the stakes change. Because now, it wasn't just about whether people found the video funny or offensive. It was about narrative control. Who gets to define what this video means? The creator? The audience? The media? Or the public figures being discussed? Erika Kirk's camp, whether directly or indirectly, became part of the conversation simply because silence was no longer neutral. Online culture rarely interprets silence as absence. It interprets silence as strategy. And strategy, in turn, gets analyzed just like everything else. As speculation grew, so did pressure for a response. Not necessarily a formal statement, but some acknowledgement that the conversation was being seen. And this pressure didn't come from one direction, it came from all sides simultaneously. Supporters wanted reassurance. Critics wanted accountability. Neutral observers wanted clarification. And commentators wanted content. That convergence is what turns a viral moment into a conflict loop. Every possible response carried risk. Responding directly could validate the parody and extend its lifespan. Ignoring it could allow interpretations to harden uncontested. Even indirect engagement, liking posts, sharing content, or addressing unrelated topics, was being scrutinized for hidden meaning. Meanwhile, Druski's silence during this entire phase became its own separate storyline. At first, people assumed he would address it quickly. That is usually how viral comedy controversies go: a skit drops, reactions follow, and then the creator clarifies intent. But days passed, and there was nothing. No explanation. No defense. No correction. That silence created a vacuum, and the internet immediately filled it with interpretation. For his supporters, the silence was confidence, proof that the parody spoke for itself and did not require justification. For critics, it was avoidance, a refusal to engage with the consequences of the content. But for the algorithm, it was perfect fuel. Because uncertainty generates engagement faster than resolution ever could. And while the internet debated intent, something else began happening in the background. The parody started evolving independently of its creator. Memes emerged that detached the character from any original context. People began using clips of the video to comment on unrelated topics. The character became shorthand for behavior, attitude, and cultural critique. At that point, ownership of meaning had already shifted away from Druski entirely. That is the first real twist: the content stopped belonging to the creator. And then came the second escalation point. A wave of commentary began framing the situation not just as a parody controversy, but as part of a broader pattern of how public figures are portrayed online. Discussions about satire, boundaries, and representation started appearing in spaces that had nothing to do with entertainment: political commentary channels, cultural analysis podcasts, and even mainstream media segments. That expansion changed the tone of the entire conversation. Because once a viral moment becomes a case study, it stops being temporary. It becomes reference material. Erika Kirk, intentionally or not, had now become a focal point in a much larger discussion about media portrayal and digital satire. And Druski, intentionally or not, had become the example used to explore where comedy ends and commentary begins. But the most important part of this entire phase was not the reaction from the public, it was the structural imbalance it revealed. Druski did not need to participate in any of it. His content existed independently. It was being amplified, debated, and analyzed without any additional input from him. Meanwhile, every attempt by others to define or respond to it only increased its reach. This is the paradox at the center of modern viral conflict: the more energy you put into controlling the narrative, the more uncontrollable it becomes. And that brings us to the first real turning point in the story. Because at this stage, the situation was no longer about whether the parody was funny or offensive. It was about whether anyone involved could still control what it had become. And increasingly, the answer was looking like no. By the time the conversation reached its third wave of circulation, the situation had already moved far beyond a typical internet controversy. What started as a parody video had now transformed into a multi-layered digital narrative, one where every new reaction added a new layer of meaning, and every attempt to clarify anything only seemed to complicate it further. At this stage, the internet wasn't just discussing the video anymore. It was actively reconstructing it. Clips were being slowed down, zoomed in, color graded, and re-uploaded with annotations. Creators on every platform were treating it like forensic material. Entire live streams were dedicated to breaking down specific scenes, even when those scenes were purely comedic in origin. The more people analyzed, the more interpretations multiplied, and the more interpretations multiplied, the more the original meaning faded into the background. And this is where escalation begins in modern viral culture, not with new facts, but with intensified interpretation. The most significant shift came when commentary channels started framing the parody not just as comedy, but as a reflection of real-world behavior patterns. Once that framing took hold, the conversation stopped being about Druski's intent entirely. It became about what viewers believed the parody revealed. That belief system is what pushed the narrative into its most volatile phase. Erika Kirk, already heavily discussed online due to her public visibility, was now being inserted into multiple overlapping narratives at once: political commentary, entertainment satire, and cultural critique. Each group interpreted the parody differently, but all of them treated it as symbolic rather than fictional. And symbolism spreads faster than truth. As engagement surged, so did the intensity of comparisons. Old clips of speeches, interviews, and public appearances began circulating again, not as full context pieces, but as short, isolated moments. These clips were then placed next to the parody for comparison, creating a visual argument that required no explanation. Viewers didn't need to read analysis anymore, they were being shown evidence in split-screen format. This is where escalation becomes self-perpetuating. Because once viewers feel like they are seeing the truth, the need for official clarification diminishes. Instead, they begin building their own conclusions, and those conclusions become content for others to react to. Then came the moment that shifted the tone of the entire situation, the first wave of widely shared interpretation claims. These were not official statements, not verified reports, and not confirmed details. They were commentary-driven narratives, videos and posts suggesting that the parody resonated with ongoing public discussions about authenticity, media persona construction, and performance versus reality in public life. In simpler terms, the internet began treating the parody as if it had revealed something deeper about Erika Kirk's public image, whether or not that interpretation was fair, accurate, or intended. That's when the escalation crossed into full narrative expansion. At this point, even neutral viewers were being pulled into the debate. The algorithm was now aggressively surfacing related content, reaction videos, breakdowns, counter-breakdowns, and response clips responding to other response clips. Every platform was reinforcing the idea that this was not just a video, it was an event. And events demand explanation. The pressure for clarity increased on all sides. Supporters of Erika Kirk argued that the situation was being exaggerated and distorted by online commentary culture. Critics argued that the parody only gained traction because it reflected already existing perceptions. Meanwhile, neutral observers were increasingly confused, because the more they tried to understand the situation, the more fragmented it became. But the real escalation point came when the conversation began expanding beyond entertainment commentary channels and into broader cultural discourse. Suddenly, the parody was being referenced in discussions about satire boundaries, media responsibility, and the relationship between public figures and digital representation. Podcasts, live stream panels, and even mainstream commentary spaces began debating whether modern parody has become too intertwined with real-world identities to remain purely comedic. This is where the situation stopped being a viral video and became a case study. And once something becomes a case study, it gains permanence. At the same time, Druski's silence continued, and that silence itself became a major narrative force. In earlier stages, it was interpreted as confidence. Now, it was being interpreted in multiple conflicting ways depending on who was analyzing it. Some claimed it demonstrated control, that he understood exactly how viral cycles work and was intentionally allowing the moment to amplify itself. Others argued it showed strategic detachment, a refusal to validate the controversy. Critics, however, framed it as calculated indifference, suggesting that silence allowed the narrative to grow unchecked. But regardless of interpretation, one fact was undeniable: the lack of response created space. And in internet culture, space is always filled. Then came the shocking reveal moment, not in the form of a single statement or leaked information, but in the way the parody itself began to detach completely from its original context. A new wave of content emerged that no longer referenced Druski as the creator or Erika Kirk as the subject. Instead, the character from the parody began being used independently as a meme archetype. People were using clips of the performance to represent broader behaviors in politics, media, and public discourse. In other words, the character outgrew the controversy. This is a critical turning point that most viral moments never reach, when the original participants are no longer required for the content to remain relevant. At the same time, commentary creators began making a different kind of argument, one that reframed the entire situation. Instead of asking whether the parody was accurate or fair, they began asking why it worked so well in the first place. And the answers they proposed added a new layer of tension. They pointed to modern media dynamics, where public figures are constantly performing under visibility. They discussed how audiences interpret authenticity through fragmented clips rather than full narratives. They argued that parody only becomes powerful when it connects to something already present in public perception, whether that perception is fair or distorted. This shift in framing changed everything. because now, the conversation wasn't just about one video anymore. It was about the nature of public identity in the digital age. And that's when the escalation reached its peak intensity. Every platform was now feeding into the cycle simultaneously. TikTok edits, YouTube breakdowns, X threads, live stream debates, all reinforcing slightly different versions of the same event. Each version added emotional weight, interpretation, or skepticism. And none of them could be considered final. The most shocking realization for many viewers was not anything contained in the parody itself, but the realization that the parody no longer mattered in isolation. What mattered was the ecosystem it created around itself. At this point, Erika Kirk's public image, Druski's comedic reputation, and the audience's interpretation habits were all intertwined in a single, ongoing narrative loop. Each influenced the other. Each reaction became part of the story. And none of it could be cleanly separated anymore. That is the true escalation, when the reaction becomes more significant than the original content. And just as the conversation appeared to be stabilizing into predictable camps, defenders, critics, and neutral commentators, a final layer emerged that reframed everything again. It wasn't a new video. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't a response. It was the realization that the parody had already achieved its biggest impact without requiring any further input from its creator. Because at this stage, Druski didn't need to escalate anything further. The internet was doing it for him. By the time the story reached mainstream commentary spaces, the reaction phase had fully taken over the narrative. What started as a viral parody clip was now a full-scale media discussion, with influencers, entertainment commentators, political voices, and everyday social media users all adding their own interpretation into the mix. And unlike earlier stages, where the debate was mostly confined to short clips and comment sections, this phase introduced something new: organized opinion formation. Entire platforms were now producing structured takes, breakdown videos, podcast discussions, and panel-style reactions that treated the situation as a cultural moment rather than just entertainment content. The first major divide in public reaction was immediate and predictable. On one side, supporters of Druski defended the parody as a continuation of his established comedic identity. They argued that his brand has always relied on exaggerated characters drawn from recognizable real-world behaviors, not direct impersonations. To them, the controversy itself was proof of success, because comedy that lands completely harmlessly rarely becomes this widely discussed. From this perspective, the reaction was not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of impact. Fans emphasized that Druski's style has always walked a line between familiarity and exaggeration. His characters are designed to feel recognizable, without being literal representations of any one person. Supporters argued that audiences were projecting meaning onto a performance that was intentionally broad, and that the backlash said more about viewer interpretation than creator intent. But the opposing side saw it very differently. Critics and commentary voices argued that even if the intent was comedic, the effect was unavoidable. They pointed to how quickly viewers began mapping the parody onto a real public figure, and how that association spread faster than any clarification or defense could contain it. In their view, the issue was not whether Druski named anyone, it was whether the performance was specific enough to trigger mass identification. And in the attention economy, perception often outweighs intent. This disagreement formed the foundation of the broader industry reaction. Entertainment commentators began framing the situation as part of a larger trend in digital comedy, where satire, imitation, and cultural commentary increasingly blur together until audiences can no longer clearly separate character from reference. Podcast hosts debated whether modern parody has become too precise for its own good. Some argued that comedians are now so skilled at mimicking real-world behavior that audiences inevitably assume real targets, even when none are intended. Others suggested the opposite, that audiences have become so hyper-aware and analytical that they now interpret references where none exist. Either way, the industry consensus was clear on one point: this wasn't just about one video anymore. It was about how digital audiences consume content in general. As reactions multiplied, mainstream media outlets began covering the story, not as entertainment gossip, but as a broader cultural moment. Headlines focused less on the video itself and more on what it represented: the intersection of parody, public perception, and online amplification. This shift in framing brought new voices into the conversation, including media analysts and commentators who rarely engage with viral entertainment disputes. Their involvement elevated the discussion from social media debate to cultural analysis. One of the most repeated themes across industry commentary was the speed of narrative formation. Analysts pointed out how quickly a single clip could evolve into a multi-layered discourse involving politics, identity, media ethics, and audience interpretation, all within a matter of hours. They also highlighted the role of algorithmic distribution. The more controversial interpretations gained traction, the more they were amplified, creating a cycle where extreme takes often outperformed nuanced ones simply because they generated more engagement. In that environment, clarity struggles to survive. Meanwhile, audience reaction remained sharply divided. On social media platforms, users were split into three main camps. The first camp treated the parody as harmless entertainment and criticized the backlash as overreaction. The second camp believed the sketch was too closely aligned with real-world figures and argued that public perception naturally turns satire into commentary. The third camp remained uncertain, watching both sides argue while trying to understand what the actual intent was supposed to be. That third group is often overlooked, but it's the largest in most viral controversies. These are the passive viewers who do not post aggressively but consume everything, and whose engagement quietly drives the algorithm forward. Within this reaction cycle, Erika Kirk became a focal point whether she actively participated or not. Commentary creators dissected her public image, past appearances, and media presence as part of broader analysis videos. Some defended her against what they saw as unfair targeting, while others used her visibility as a reference point in discussions about public persona and satire. Importantly, much of this discussion was not driven by new actions from Erika Kirk or Druski. It was driven by reinterpretation of existing material. That is a defining feature of modern viral culture. No new events are required for narratives to continue expanding. As long as there is content to analyze, the conversation can sustain itself indefinitely. Industry professionals also weighed in on the broader implications for creators like Druski. Some praised his ability to generate massive engagement without direct controversy statements, noting that the silence strategy, intentional or not, allowed the content to circulate freely without interruption. Others warned that this type of viral amplification comes with risks, particularly when audiences assign real-world identities to fictional characters. They argued that once that connection is made, creators lose control over interpretation entirely, regardless of intent. What made this reaction phase particularly unusual was that both defenders and critics agreed on one underlying fact: the video had become bigger than itself. Even those criticizing it acknowledged its reach, its engagement, and its cultural penetration. Even those defending it acknowledged how quickly it escalated beyond typical parody discussions. And that shared recognition is what solidified the moment as an industry-level talking point. By the end of this phase, the story had fully detached from its original format. It was no longer a video, no longer a single performance, and no longer even a debate about comedy boundaries. It had become a reference point, something used to illustrate how quickly modern audiences can transform entertainment content into cultural discourse. And in that transformation, the reactions themselves became part of the content. Which meant the story was no longer being told from the outside. It was now being built by everyone involved in it. By the time the conversation finally started to feel like it was slowing down, most people assumed the cycle had already reached its peak. The parody had gone viral, the reactions had divided the internet, the media had weighed in, and both supporters and critics had settled into their positions. In most online controversies, this is usually the point where attention fades and the algorithm moves on. But this situation didn't fade. It mutated. Because just when viewers thought they understood what this was, a comedian, a viral sketch, and a wave of over-analysis, a final shift in narrative perception changed the entire framing of the story one last time. The twist wasn't a new video. It wasn't a response from Erika Kirk. And it wasn't even a statement from Druski. It was the realization that the entire situation had already outgrown all three of them. As commentary channels continued dissecting the parody and its aftermath, a new pattern began to emerge in the way audiences were engaging with it. People were no longer debating whether the sketch was accurate or inappropriate. Instead, they were debating why it had this level of impact at all. That question seemed simple at first, but it quickly opened the door to a much deeper and more uncomfortable conversation about modern attention culture. Because the more analysts looked at it, the more they realized something unusual: the parody itself was no longer the center of attention. It had become a mirror event, a moment that reflected back the audience's own behavior more than it reflected any individual person. Every side of the debate was, in its own way, reinforcing the same cycle. Those defending the parody amplified it by breaking it down and sharing it widely. Those criticizing it amplified it by analyzing it and connecting it to broader social themes. Even neutral observers contributed simply by engaging with explanations, summaries, and reaction content. The result was a self-sustaining ecosystem where the original video no longer needed active promotion, because the reaction content had become the engine. And that realization created the first fracture in the narrative. Suddenly, some commentators began shifting their tone. Instead of focusing on Druski or Erika Kirk, they started focusing on the audience itself. They pointed out that viral culture no longer distinguishes clearly between content and interpretation, and that once a moment reaches a certain scale, meaning is no longer assigned by the creator, but collectively constructed by viewers. That shift changed how people interpreted everything that came before it. What had originally been framed as a parody controversy was now being reframed as an example of collective narrative building. In this version of events, no single person controlled the story. Not the comedian, not the subject, and not even the media. The story was being generated in real time by millions of micro-reactions that stacked on top of each other until they formed something much larger than the original input. And that's where the final twist deepened. Because as this meta-narrative gained traction, older clips of the parody started resurfacing again, but this time they were being used in a completely different context. Instead of being analyzed for resemblance or intent, they were being used as examples in discussions about how internet audiences construct meaning. The parody had become academic material in real time. That alone would have been enough to signal the end of the cycle in a traditional media environment. But in the current attention economy, there is no true end. There is only transformation. And that transformation introduced the cliffhanger. A new wave of commentary began questioning what comes next for situations like this, where parody, identity, and public perception collide so quickly that no official clarification can realistically reset the narrative. Some argued that creators will eventually adapt by becoming even more abstract, distancing their characters further from real-world references. Others suggested the opposite, that audiences will become even more aggressive in identifying real-world parallels in everything they see. But the most unsettling theory was the simplest one, that control is no longer part of the equation at all. In this view, once a piece of content reaches a certain level of virality, it stops belonging to its creator entirely. It becomes part of the internet's shared memory, endlessly reinterpreted, remixed, and reframed based on whatever cultural moment happens to be unfolding at the time. That's when attention returned, unexpectedly, back to Druski. Not because he had said anything new, but because he still hadn't said anything at all. His silence, which had once been interpreted as confidence, then as strategy, and later as detachment, was now being interpreted in yet another way, inevitability. Some commentators began suggesting that he never needed to respond because the cycle itself was the response. The parody had already achieved its effect without commentary, clarification, or correction. But that idea raised an even bigger question, one that nobody could answer confidently. If a creator can produce something that generates this level of cultural reaction without speaking again, then who is actually steering the conversation? Is it the creator? Is it the audience? Or is it the system that rewards engagement above all else? Meanwhile, Erika Kirk's presence in the conversation had not disappeared either, but it had shifted into something more symbolic. She was no longer being discussed as an individual in most commentary spaces. Instead, she had become a reference point in discussions about visibility, persona, and how public identity is constructed under constant scrutiny. And that shift is what made the situation feel unresolved. Because once a real person becomes a symbol in online discourse, the narrative stops needing their participation to continue. And so, the cliffhanger isn't about what any one person will do next. It's about what the internet will do next. Because the same cycle that turned a parody video into a global conversation is still active. The same mechanisms are still running. The same audiences are still engaged. And the same question remains unanswered. When everything becomes content, what happens to the people inside it? And as the conversation continues to echo across platforms, one thing becomes clear: this story isn't ending. It's just waiting for the next trigger. At this point, the conversation around this parody is no longer just about one video, one comedian, or one public figure. It has become something much bigger, a reflection of how quickly narratives form, spread, and evolve in the digital age. And whether someone sees it as comedy, criticism, or cultural commentary, one thing is clear: the internet has fully taken control of the story. Now the real question is what people do with moments like this. Because every viral situation only exists as long as people keep feeding it attention. Every replay, every reaction video, every breakdown, every argument in the comments, all of it adds fuel. And in today's attention economy, attention is the most powerful currency driving the entire cycle. Some viewers will see this situation and focus on the humor. Others will focus on the controversy. Others will focus on what it says about media, identity, and public perception. But no matter which side anyone falls on, the engagement itself is what keeps the cycle alive. And that's why awareness matters. Not just awareness of the parody itself, but awareness of how quickly interpretation can become narrative, and how quickly narrative can become fact in the eyes of online audiences. Once that shift happens, it becomes almost impossible to reverse, because people don't experience content in isolation anymore. They experience it through clips, reactions, edits, and commentary layers stacked on top of each other. So the real takeaway here isn't about picking a side. It's about understanding how fast the system moves, and how easily meaning can change depending on who is sharing the story and how it's being framed. Before reacting to the next viral moment, before jumping into the next trending debate, it's worth asking a simple question: is this information, or is this interpretation being passed around as information? Because in a space where everything spreads instantly, slowing down your reaction is sometimes the only way to see clearly. And if this breakdown helped you understand how this situation escalated, from a parody video to a full cultural conversation, then stay tuned, because stories like this aren't slowing down anytime soon. They are multiplying. The internet doesn't wait for closure. It waits for the next spark.